It was much later, far in the future, as Osrith was preparing to leave Mercia, that Elfda told her that it had been her warriors who had insisted she led them into Lundin. Leofstan had petitioned Miral, he said, and all 5 of them had stood before him, insisting. But that night, Osrith did not know this, although she was still elated. It was what she had wanted, what she had trained for, but she was also mystified. She had been called to guard Ethelfled and only a week later, called back to her men. Other men were to guard her, and the women, at the camp. And so, on a cool, spring morning, the mercenary army strode out to their ancient city. As they walked, surrounded by other mercenary divisions from all over the kingdom, Osrith was pleased to see that the Wessex army was far away, heading to the southern side of the city at Bedford, crossing the ancient bridge and taking the road that would take them to the centre, where the Danes were. Ethelred, on the other hand, was sending half of his men up the river with Aldhelm, and taking the other half himself to the northern side. Osrith and her men were going on foot, and as they marched, she agreed with him the tactics they would be using: to stick together, to skirmish, to secure streets bit by bit, and ensure that no Danes hid who could spring a counter-attack behind them. And no rape, she told the men, clearly, as they stopped for rest within sight of the city walls. I say this not as a woman, but as a warrior. Should you want to hump, wait until we have won, and get a whore and pay her, honestly. I need you together for our strategy to work. Osrith then asked the men to show her what they had practiced, and was mainly interested in how they carried it, their moves. Their skills had improved, and it was clear Elfrith and Elfka had been successful in their training them, for the men could carry out her commands by rote. But then, plans changed, and the whole of the mercenary army were told to sail, with Ethelred taking the lead, Aldhelm beside him. They were to sail against the tidal current of the Thames, Miral told Osrith eventually, as the night before, as the army camped within sight of Lundin's walls. Distracted by a pain in her abdomen that Osrith was not used to, for she had recently used the last of the roots sold to her by Allah, she idly wondered as she sat on duty, if Britons inhabited the city, and whether, with a sober quantity of silver about her person, she would be able to find them and offer their healer several in exchange for lily root, at least. But that was all it was, a thought, for the morning light came all too quickly and the men were ushered from camp to begin their attack. Lord Ethelred had taken a northerly path to the city, and Lord Aldhelm had ordered different sections of the army in different direction when they had passed through Ludgate, in order to herd the Northmen into the very centre of Lundin. Eglwulf, one of her younger men, had stopped in appalled wonder as they had approached the city at the barbarity of the Northmen. They had crept through the streets and defeated many, clearing paths of the enemy so they would not counter with a rear attack, working their way up until the moment they had got to the main Roman buildings at the very centre. Siegfried and Eric Thurgilson had made it their own. Osrith's heart beat as she stayed her half-dozen men. All of the mercenaries stayed, when they looked beyond. For, in the very heart of Lundin, on a cross, a man had been nailed, in a very bald, openly mocking caricature of Christ on his cross. He was dead. Osrith could see that, though no one was going to try to get him down. And then she saw Eric, her once temporary ally, standing next to his brother, a blade strapped to his sword hand. She had turned from him at the battle before Dunnottar, and had heard the battle roar as she had fled Alba, when the brothers had tried again to defeat Domhnall. Once she had heard that they were in Lundin, trying their luck with Kent, East Anglia and the bits of Mercia and Wessex around the old Roman city. She found she was glad and relieved that her king, for she still automatically thought of Domhnall as that, had been victorious. Though she had gleaned it from stealing glances from the Wessex documents, to see them here, before her, at a gruesome truce, gave her a trickle of joy into her stomach. Osrith's joy soured a little when she caught sight brother. He stood there, tall and broad, glorious in gleaming Frankish mail with the pagan hammers of his defeated enemies, and a cloak, shoulder to ankle, black with a silver lightning bolt on its back. Osrith felt angry at the way he had chosen to treat her. And not just her, he treated many people shabbily, even Lord Ethelred, so she had heard from, who else? Elfrith, and had indeed caused the damage to Aldhelm's face. But worse than that, he treated women as objects. Was it not the same in Alba? except women were closer to women in authority, as in Mercia. Lands uninfluenced by Francia was where the sexes were levelled: Alba, Wellies, Pitland, Gaelish lands, Strathclyde. The Druid stratum levelled it further. For the denigration of women to possessions came only from the Roman Church. Hold! Her brother shouted, and automatically, Mercia's men stopped, too. The square was still as the standoff held and all were waiting for Uhtred, not the Lord Aethliad, and Osric watched as he took the lead and spoke to Siegfried and Eric, trying not to look at the man beside him. And then it was done, a negotiation for the release of a prisoner by trial of combat. The man declared himself to be a Briton, and Osric immediately paid more attention. He asked for a sword, and one of the Norse, who had been caressing a woman on one of the steps in the center of the city, stepped forward. But Father Pylig, for that was who he was, Osric found out later, knew exactly how to challenge that young, arrogant man, and within 10 minutes had him on his knees, demanding his freedom, as agreed. When he got up, he strode across to stand beside the Wessex faction, and was greeted with a clap on the back by both Osric's brother and, more astonishingly, by Father Bocca. Astonishing, because Osric thought that Bocca would have remained behind with his wife at the camp. And, how good were the men left behind? They were soon to find out, for a cry went up, for an alarm of banging metal, and a fire's smoke rose up. The camp had been raided, most of the guards had been slain. And the Lady Ethelfled had been taken. 88,888,888. I understand, Aldhelm asked, when Miral brought Osric to see the commander of the army, that you can speak Norse. The aftermath of the raid had seen the army secure the camp, bury the dead, and carry the corpses of the Danish and Northman raiders across to the neighboring field and begin to light a big pyre. And, all the while, Lord Aethliad moped and griped about the loss of his wife. Indeed, Osric replied. Her first thought was one of doubt, surely no one thought her capable of any conspiracy against the Wessexes and Mersons? Had she not sworn? But it was not that. And your sword skill is exemplary. I saw you better at least a dozen Norse and Danish raiders today. Osric said nothing, but nodded. She had. And so had many other men. Falkbald had ended the lives of at least twice that many and had secured the Thurgilson brothers' surrender of Lundin. Osric had planned to reward them with her own silver before the raid had soured their victory. Thank you. But Aldhelm looked severe. Severe, and serious. He was worried, and he had every right to, considering what was at stake. It was your duty to guard the lad Ethelfled, he reminded her, his long nose pointing down towards Osric. It was, she agreed, and then you told me that the Lord Aethliad had commanded I bring my men. Indeed, Aldhelm cut in. And so you must now return to guarding the lady, Aldhelm said, patiently. He pointed to a pile of clothing that had once belonged to the now ashed enemy who had been killed by some of the Merson and Wessex guards at the camp, at least. Osric looked at the furs and leather, swords and axes. A good hoard. If you were to have to guard the Lady Ethelfled, even now, how would you go about it? Osric looked at the battle spoils again, and then knelt, to pick up something. It was a Thor's hammer. I would dress as a Dane. I would follow them, to wherever you would tell me they were going with her. Beamflout, Aldhelm supplied. And at Beamflout, I would ensure her safety, with my life. It was the correct answer. Aldhelm was already nodding her head. Then our ideas are the same. I propose that you attend Lord Aethliad as one of his men at Beamflout, for we have already secured a meeting with the Thurgilson brothers, and then remain behind when we leave. Osric thought about that, and then nodded. I agree, she said, a coldness stealing over her. She had no choice. Ethelfled captured might mean she was in danger. Yet, she would be ransomed, and worth more, unspoiled. She began, but Aldhelm held up a hand. Your warrior, Alfkin, is also missing. He was not with the women in the forest. We do not know if he is dead. But one of the wives did say that some of the younger men had been taken away by retreating pagans. As slaves, no doubt, Miral put in. Both men were looking at Osric, who was silent, her mind racing. All that they proposed should indeed work. When they left, she could disguise herself easily if she made sure she accessorized herself appropriately. Many of Eric's men were as astute as Wessexers and Mersons, any tiny deviation, and she would be discovered. She could locate Ethelfled, and keep her safe. Get her out, if she could. She could report, if he could, anything of value. If this is too big a challenge, Oldham continued, mistaking her silent thoughts as doubts, then by all means, you must say. But Osrith shook her head. My lord, I can do this, and I will do this. I will do my utmost to keep the Lady of the Mersons safe. 88,888,888. And now, after an arduous march quickly east to the coastal fortification, Osrith was standing in the hall, Mersons on one side, West Saxons on the other. Around an oblong table sat Utard, who else, representing Wessex, with Father Baku and Steeper beside him, and on the other, Aldhelm, for Mercia. And where was her lord? He had been put quickly on his back by one of Eric's men, having said a few brief words to Ethelfled. It was the first time Osrith had seen her since Ethelred had ordered her to take back command of her division, and she looked as ill as she had done when she had been under Osrith's protection. But no more harmed. Indeed, there was a colour to her cheeks, and she had looked at her husband in the eye when he had spoken to her, rather than away. So, Osrith stood in the hall, clad in Norse leathers, a worn belt and short and long scabbards that were not hers. She had refused Aldhelm's advice that she should give up tagged seeks and buoy, but these were not an issue. Many warriors carried all manner of ironware, so these would not draw the attention of anyone, particularly. Around her neck, but tucked close to her chest, hung a Thor's hammer. When she had put it on, Osrith thought, it wasn't that much different in shape to a Christian cross, the horizontal section being somewhat longer, and the top section a little shorter. Over these clothes, she pressed her own, and was still an English warrior at the side of her Merson lord, and now she was listening to the pissing contest that was the agreement of the wealth that would be traded in exchange for Ethelfled's life. She looked across to her brother every so often. He was relishing the debate, Osrith could tell, just to have the opportunity to speak, to brag, to show off. It was when the negotiators made to leave that Osrith made her move. Trying to ignore Finan as much as she could, which had been hard when she had been standing not far from the man, and heard him speak and listened to his dry sarcasm, she wondered about Ethelfled. Could she free her? Osrith thought, as she slipped into the kitchens. Slaves prepared food for the Norse and Danes, and by the time she had got to the larders already her own clothing was often hidden beneath boards which led to the cellars. She loosened her hair, so it flowed down her back as one long braid, making she fixed her pearl jewel into her hair at the top. And then Osrith discovered Ethelfled's location. A maid was preparing food on a tray, and she heard her say to another that the lady was to have more bread, more meat. The other maid, avoiding two Danish guards' advances, took the tray out with her. Osrith followed her, and fell into step beside a second guard, who had clearly been ordered to accompany the maid. He nudged Osrith as if he knew her, and kept pointing out the maid's ass and tits, the maid growing ever embarrassed at being stared at until she thrust the tray into Osrith's arms and hurried back to the kitchens. This way, the second guard pointed, or have you forgotten the way? He leaned conspiratorially towards Osrith, and added, I did myself outside this morning, thinking of her face. That is not all you were thinking of, I imagine. Osrith attempted, and the words must have worked, for the guard nudged her arm, nearly causing her to spill the contents of the tray. Are you going to linger, when you take in the tray? He added, as he nodded towards the gated room, which might once have been a stable but was now guarded by 4 of Eric's men. Osrith recognized them from her time with the Norse in Alba, but said nothing to them as the guard filled the void. Is the clothed then, the princess? The guard, whose name turned out to be Rorik, asked the others. Unfortunately for us, nodded one, slapping down a plain tile onto a square board, and adding a copper coin to the top of it. Osrith recognized it to be a gambling game. They had played something similar at July, the men betting even more extravagant sums on the roll of a cube with runes upon it, which caused the pieces to move in certain directions around the board. one of them scraped a chair back, and spat onto the earth. With a grunt, he reached for a ring of keys and found the one he needed, turning the key. Inside, Osrith heard a sharp intake of breath as the metal lock clicked, and she looked upon a face, alert and cautious, arms folded around herself. Perhaps Ethelfled was used to her meal at this time, perhaps she would have looked more frightened if her prison, for that was what this place, though well kept and furnished ostensibly was, had been opened at an unexpected time. "Put it on the table," she ordered. Osrith fixed her with a stare and, for a brief moment, their eyes met, before Osrith strode to the small table beside the bed and placed it down. "And take the other," Ethelfled added, imperiously. For a prisoner, she was not acting like one. Behind her, the man who had opened the door was getting edgy. Osrith could sense he wanted to rush in and claim her, and yet, he knew what wrath would be upon him from the brothers, if he did that. But he did not like her tone. The princess was a prisoner, the man knew, and should not be speaking like that. Osrith did what the lady had told her to, and removed herself from the room, making up the passage towards the kitchens with Rorik tagging along behind her. "That bitch!" he exclaimed, spitting onto the ground. "She deserves a good humping. And you know," his voice dropped conspiratorially, "I do believe she's getting one." When Osrith protested ignorance, which, in her case, was entirely true, Rorik confided that she had been seen in the company of Eric Thurgilson on more than one occasion. "You are not one of the brothers' men, are you?" he asked, when Osrith had put the tray back onto one of the kitchen tables, and had been chastised by the cook, though a slave himself, for not putting it where one of the maids could wash it. She wasn't, Osrith admitted, and had come down to the brothers on the word of one of her cousins, who had died. "And from where do you come?" Rorik asked. "Aalborg," Osrith said, having absolutely no clue where the place was. She had heard it was a city in the northern part of Denmark, and agreed with Rorik when he asked her whether her family had been boat builders. "It explains your accent," Rorik said, happily, and went back to guarding the kitchens, Osrith with him, and owned the role, as if this was something she had been asked to do by either Siegfried or Eric had commanded, on the day they had slaughtered King Ethelstan of East Anglia's men of Beamflout. So this guard, who had seen her randomly one day, had taken up to chatting with her, assuming Osrith was just another warrior, drawn to stronger leaders through want of food and wealth. And the Thurgilsons definitely promised wealth. Even now, Osrith wondered whether the message had got to Alfred. The two kingdoms could never pay the money the brothers asked, and they knew it. A day turned into a week, which turned into 3. Osrith had spent nearly every minute on the mission to keep eyes on Ethelfled and glean as much information as she could, though what exactly she would do with it, Osrith could not tell, for there was no one able to send word to anyone outside of Beamflout. And, she discovered, a man whom she had met, who had boarded and raided Gert and Ulf's fishing boat, was also part of the brothers' band, and Rorik's chief. Had she met the young man before that day? Had he been there when Heston had tried to make a bargain for her with Gert, before stealing the silver she had given to the Frisian man for her passage? One thing was for sure, her position in Beamflout was getting trickier. 88,888,888. On the second day of the 4th week, as Osrith took the tray away from a sleepy Ethelfled, 2 things happened. The second was that she saw Eric Thurgilson sneak the key and its ring back into the hand of the guard, who was now blotto, face down on the table. Clearly a wine adulterated with some sort of spirit or medicine had caused the men to sleep, and she watched, unseen by the woodpile, as he woke the men up, pressing coins and gaming pieces into their hands. That's when Osrith knew the Norseman had been with Ethelfled, and when Osrith returned with the lady's food that evening, she really saw the woman, no longer a shy, subdued person, but full of life, full of hope. Which was strange, as word had not yet come to Beamflout as to whether Alfred agreed to the ransom. The second thing, to Osrith's horror, was that, inching down her leg was, suddenly, her monthly blood. Perhaps if she had ingratiated herself with Eric, admitted she was his enemy, but had asked him where he had got the medicine which had put them to sleep, Osrith might not be in the situation. And it was Rorik who had expressed concern as drops of blood spilled onto the flagstone floor. "I fell," Osrith lied, and cut my leg on sharp rock. When Rorik offered to bandage her injury, Osrith declined, politely, and when he was fast asleep that night she went to a place she knew was concealed, at the far end of the estuary where the Flout River met the sea and strong current pushed the water out to sea. There, she stripped to her cloth bindings concealed between two boulders, relishing the cold water, which was refreshing on her skin after a sticky, humid day. Could she free the lady? Osrith washed between her legs before finding leaves with which to pack herself and curling them up to fit. It was a tricky thought, complicated still by the fact she had no ally on her side as representing Mercia with whom she could plan an escape for the princess. Besides, Ethelfled looked so well, would she come willingly? A grain of emotion, not anger, not jealousy, more outrage and bitterness, entered her chest as Osrith thought of the likelihood that Ethelfled had formed an attachment to Eric. How dare she risk 2 kingdoms for her heart? There was Osrith, who had resisted men, regardless of her feelings once she had come to Wessex, and then gone to Mercia, for her own sake, and the sake of entanglements and difficulties, and all the while the Lady Ethelfled entertained possible ideas of an attachment to Eric, and he her. Though, she could be wrong, Osrith told herself. But her first instinct seemed the most plausible, and that instinct had never seen her false. Osrith looked at the lapping of the water between the 2 high rocks, and thought instead about a thing that had brought her joy, tending to the horses. Osrith had seen the figure of a young Saxon boy. She had found Elfkin, who had seemed not displeased in his role, and did not seem to be harmed or underfed. Could she free him, too? Osrith made to comb through her hair with a bone comb which had been with the spoils from the Danish and Norse battle dead, when hands suddenly gripped her, around her body, around her mouth, and she was dragged underwater. Osrith fought with all her might, her naked body remembering the fear of the Foyle River where it met the sea, where she had nearly been murdered by the incoming tide. No, nearly murdered by the 2 allied princes. But, as suddenly as it had happened, the hands let her go, and she splashed to the surface. I recognized my jewel, Kriegik Vind, said Eric Thurgilson, amusement playing on his lips. Eric. No matter that he was not on her side in this war, nevertheless, Osrith found that she was overjoyed to see him. You're wet, he complained, when Osrith stepped back, and then a frown overcame him. You should not have bathed here at night, you could have been followed. I was, wasn't I? And your clothes may have been stolen. Osrith quickly looked around. Nothing she had taken off was where she had left it, beside a rock which flattened out like a seat and fell away into the river. If you have my clothes, give them to me, Osrith demanded. Amusement played at the corner of the Northman's mouth again, and he paused, as if giving her suggestion a great deal of serious thought. Then, he handed her a bundle, wrapped delicately with the cord of her cloak. Osrith shook the clothes apart. But, still something was missing. You still put on your bindings? It was not a question, and Eric Thurgilson then handed Osrith the linen strip she used to flatten her chest. As you showed me, Osrith replied, now glancing out to the eastern sea for somewhere to look while she dressed, but when she turned to him, Eric was staring at her naked body. I do remember your body, he mused, I tell you, you have a fine body, though your tits are much smaller than I remember. He was provoking her, Osrith knew, and it occurred to her that, when he had known her in Alba she had been pregnant with Constantine's child. I do not care about my body, she added. I wish that you had not followed me. You are Kriegik Vind, Eric replied, as if the term should mean to Osrith more than it did. It should matter not to you that I look, for you should know I would never do anything about it. It does not matter, Osrith lied, and turned her back, trying to make a start on her bindings around her chest. Despite what has been done to it in the name of war, Eric murmured, and shook his head, turning away. Couldn't you have had a quiet life? As a lady? Could you? Osrith shot back. Why did every man she knew think marriage was the only thing that occupied the thoughts of women? As a lady? Eric chuckled. I do not think a shift would fit me. And then it was Osrith's turn to laugh and, now clad only in a partially wrapped linen cloth, pulled her cloak around herself, then threw her arms around him. It was good to see him, despite everything. This, Osrith said, as she gestured back to Beamflout Fortress. The hostage. The ransom. It's your doing, isn't it? Eric nodded, unable to hide the pride that he felt. Osrith stepped back, and began to pull on the rest of her looted clothes, and noticed the astonishment on Eric's face that she slipped a Thor's hammer on a chain around her neck. You have ambition, very good, and Ethelflaed? The princess is safe, Eric assured her. But Osrith found herself frowning. You have imprisoned her, she accused. Eric paused, and stopped himself saying something he was about to. Then, he said, his voice softer, his tone regretful, I would never treat her as you were treated. And Osrith could tell then something that something she suspected from the dawn when he had left Ethelflaed, and she asked him. You followed me? He asked, accusingly. Fair is fair, Osrith replied. You would like to be with the princess. It wasn't a question, and Eric knew it. Would like? Have liked. Is she your first? Osrith couldn't resist the goad. I have lain beside many women, Eric replied, non-committally, folding his arms. I lay beside you many times myself, she reminded him. But you are prejudged. Besides, I needed you to show me your king's fortress. If you were not, I would have asked you if you wanted me, if that is your meaning. A little sparkle of emotion passed between them. And I would have been glad you asked, Osrith replied, though knew it was a lie. Then, at that time, she had been ill-used by Grioghair, and no matter how pleasurable Eric might have been, Osrith had not wanted him then, nor could ever entertain the idea in her mind. Then, though, Osrith's mind had been filled with her realization that she loved Tagged. She knew, also, the only reason she was talking like this to him now was because he feelings for Ethelflaed, and she disliked the woman, her arrogance, her self-entitlement. Except then, you needed a friend. I am glad you are my friend, Osrith admitted. I loved my husband, and now, you have lost your heart to the lady. And the truth was bald on his face, and Osrith was pleased, so pleased for him, despite his resentful feelings towards Ethelflaed for her stupidity. Just then, Eric Thurgilson looked like Uhtred had looked on the day of Ethelflaed's wedding, standing with Gisela, his heart and hers, together. I will get you out of here, Eric concluded, decisively, and offered a hand to Osrith, to pull her up to higher ground. She took it, and climbed her feet up the rock and onto chalk grassland. Do not let Siegfried see you, or he will kill you, he added. Not if I kill him first, Osrith declared. But this time it was Eric's turn to frown. You will not go. Osrith shook her head. I have taken on something of honor, for the Lord I swore to. Eric nodded his head, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. Uhtred came to negotiate a price for Ethelflaed, and that of Mercia, he continued. He is my lord, Osrith replied, thinking of the stuck-up, feebly intelligent lord of the Mersons. Uhtred? That Osrith specified, as they walked slowly to the East Saxon fortress. I was supposed to guard Ethelflaed. You did not do a good job. I was taken from the job to lead men against you at Lundin. You would not have her now if I had been her guard still. I have no doubt, Eric replied, stepping over a low boundary wall that delineated two long deserted farms. But your lord? Is he not in Alba? Osrith stopped, sharply. It was like you said, Osrith admitted. He had betrayed me. He had arranged for that marriage in Caerligwylid. Then you were right to leave. But why Ethelflaed? I was in Wessex. It did not suit. They are rich and... Osrith did not know the words, arrogant from the riches. I did not fit there. There was more that her tone conveyed, and Eric picked up on it. If the bastard who has upset you is here, I will kill him. Osrith smiled, at his ready defense of her. He might be, she replied, non-committally. Is it Uhtred? And Osrith found herself agreeing. You are in love with him? I have seen the way you have looked at him, when he was here, to negotiate the ransom. and Osrith had stared. It was true. But, if she had been staring at her brother, then it was because she was trying so hard not to stare at Finan. My heart is empty of that feeling, Osrith replied. I your husband, to whom you promised, I remember. Eric's sentence trailed to nothing as he thought. Then he began walking towards Beamflout again. Something to do with hands. Hands. He died, in the battle between my Lord King and the Strathclyde Cymry. I am sorry. He burned to death trying to save the lives of innocents, set by Grioghair. Remember him? I remember what he did to you, Eric replied, gently, and he glanced at her body. I saw his marks upon you still. He herded them in, like cattle, then ordered his men to set the fire. Tagged, Osrith found herself whispering his name. He handed me his seeks. Osrith put her hand to it. Then her voice took on a hard edge. And Domhnall could not deny his treachery, in the end, and put him to the sword. Very good. But Osrith was now saying nothing. To love like that, Eric mused, I know it, thought. Hooted. He looked across to her, slyly. And something in Osrith's brain made her say the most impossible thing. It turns out I do not tire of him as I expected to. Eric's shock was palpable and he stared at her face, waiting for Osrith to tell him that she was joking. Hooted? You expected to love Hooted? He asked, not expecting this from his gentle teasing. She drew to a stop, and reached for the Norseman's hands. Do you not love your brother? And afterwards, Osrith thought how good it had felt to tell him. Hooted is your brother? Eric repeated. But Osrith said nothing more, yet could not stop herself from nodding, before stepping away from him, her hand gripping tagged seeks for security. She had opened up. Now it was time to close down. I am pleased the princess is well, Osrith said, stiffly, and began to walk, in the direction of the Lundin road. You are going? Eric asked. But her feint did not fool the Northman in the slightest, and he followed this question with, no, you have a plan, I can tell. And Osrith turned back to him, buoy in her hand. I will fight you and I will win, she told him, defiantly. I do not love Wessex but I am sworn to Mercia. Much as I respect you, Eric Thurgilson, you cannot be allowed to ruin the kingdom. But now, it was Eric's turn to fall silent, and Osrith watched a pensive, serious expression take hold of his features. Then, he gently placed a hand on Osrith's back, as if guiding her in the direction of the Merson and Wessex encampment. Go, leave, I will give you passage. Get back to your army and tell them the princess is well. But you are ransoming her enough to ruin both kingdoms. Osrith protested. For, while she had bathed, her mind had run through a dozen different plans, and had settled on two which could work. Both included Elfkin's help, and she looked forward to finding him, and telling him. His help was crucial. But Eric was not protesting, or trying to argue with her. Indeed, he looked worried. It will not come to that, he broke off, and looked, almost pained, back to Beamflout. And then Osrith knew. If she had known what a jigsaw puzzle was, she might have used that analogy in her head. All of the pieces had flown together and she could see the majority of the picture. He's helping her, isn't he? Helping you both? My, she found she could not say it. Hooted? Ethelfled said he would. Then he will, Osrith assured him. Where will you go? Francia. I have family there. Then gods, be with you, she said, with a finality. It was good to see you again, Eric Thurgilson. You too, Osrith Lackland. He paused, then proposed, Osrith of ... Bibbenberg? No, she shot back, firmly. Never. I am Osrith the Gale, Osrith the Warrior, Osrith of Northumbria, as you had me to be. And then she noticed a strange light in his eyes. Kriegik Vind. Join us. And just for a moment, Osrith considered it. She would be accepted, she could fight. They would no doubt allow her to be Christian. Faith was a private matter, not one that bound you to regular attendance at a church, and a Thor's hammer would please outwardly. Osrith took Eric's hands in hers again, feeling them warm, where hers were cold. I am Osrith the Merson. Utadkin of Bibbenberg. I never want to see that place again in my life. Tack, she added. For what? For teaching me Norse. It got me in here, that is certain. Eirik grinned. For being a thoroughly good warrior and, when I needed one, a fine friend. For believing that I am a good enough warrior to be Norse. Eirik stepped away first, and looked towards the fortress, before looking back to Osrith. Osrith the Merson, he declared, if I should face you on the battlefield, I will turn from you, and planted a kiss on her cheek. Osrith threw her arms around him. And I from you, Eirik Thorgilsson, and I from you,